Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's political future in jeopardy? We discuss how a rift in his Liberal Party could threaten his bid for re-election. Are you in Canada or want to share your thoughts? Leave your comments in the YouTube chat or tweet us, and I'll do my best to bring in as many of your thoughts as I can.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Chuck Diamond from Pittsburgh, and you are in the stream.
Justin Trudeau came to power in 2015, promising a new standard of government transparency and inclusion. But a corruption scandal involving the engineering firm SNC-Lavalin and the resignation of 2 female cabinet members has called into question his reputation as a left-wing darling. Check out this report filed in March by Al Jazeera correspondent Daniel Lack.
SNC-Lavalin, one of Canada's largest engineering companies, is charged with paying bribes worth tens of millions of dollars to the government of the late Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. If found guilty, the company faces being blocked from bidding for lucrative Canadian government contracts. In extraordinary testimony to a parliamentary committee, the Attorney General said Trudeau and his advisers tried to make her accept a plea deal. Trudeau and his inside circle have said they did nothing wrong. They were acting to save a company employing nearly 10,000 Canadians. Opinion polls indicate the scandal is hurting the Prime Minister's popularity. With an election later this year, his party will have to take urgent steps to save itself from defeat. Both the cabinet ministers who resigned say they still support the government. Possible hint they'd serve another leader, someone other than Justin Trudeau. The promise of a few years ago has long gone as Canada's Prime Minister attempts to weather the worst political crisis he's ever faced.
Well, here now to help us explore whether the controversy will prove to be a referendum on both Trudeau and the Liberal Party, Chris Selly is a columnist for the National Post. He joins us from Toronto. Also in Toronto, Muniza Sheikh is a lawyer and Liberal Party supporter. And in Winnipeg, Megan Sinclair is a professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. Welcome everyone to the stream. I want to start with a headline and a new poll just out on Tuesday. Have a look here. This is from Reuters. Canada's golden boy Trudeau sinks in polls as scandal takes a toll. So I'm going to scroll down here after that kind of explosive headline there and show you this. The ruling Liberals have lost 6 percentage points since the start of the year, ceding the lead to the rival Conservatives. And if an election was held now, which it isn't, it's in October, the Conservatives would win 34.9% of the vote. Liberals 32.8%. Chris, explain this situation for us in our international audience. How big of a deal is this quote-unquote scandal?
Well, it depends what the scandal is in your mind. The root of this is, as that report explained, an allegation from former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould that the Prime Minister's office put undue pressure on her to arrange what's called the deferred prosecution agreement for SNC-Lavalin, which is a huge Quebec-based engineering firm with excellent political connections, and which had been lobbying the government hard to get that agreement. And she says he crossed the line, or his office crossed the line, or his underlings crossed the line on his behalf in trying to strong arm her into interfering when she had already decided that she wouldn't. That's the precipitating event. But what's happened since is that essentially it's called a whole bunch of elements of Trudeau's brand into question. He was supposed to be a very different kind of prime minister, pro-feminist, pro-indigenous. He said he wanted ministers who would think and act independently and do what was right, and now he's ended up kicking out of caucus Canada's first Indigenous female justice minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and another very impressive female minister, Jane Philpott, for basically standing on the same principle that Wilson-Raybould was standing on. So it's a very sort of old-style politics look, very sort of strong-arm, my way or the highway kind of approach, which is totally antithetical to the brand that he ran on in 2015 and that attracted a lot of younger, idealistic, left-leaning voters. So it depends what you think the scandal is, as I say, but I think that certainly he has done a lot of damage to that brand, which was very effective in 2015 in bringing out a certain chunk of the Canadian electorate.
And that might explain why we're seeing tweets like this. This tweeted to the stream from Dave. He says he has been spinning a different tale about SNC-Lavalin since this story broke. At no time, and we're speaking of the Prime Minister here, has he admitted even an error in judgment, not the openness and honesty he had promised, but rather the politics as usual Canada had known before. Duplicitous, really. Moniza, duplicitous. These are strong words here. What's your take on this?
I take issue with the word duplicitous, and I actually take issue with the word scandal as well. So I do my best to avoid it when I can. With respect to what's happened here, we have the better part of about 6 or 7 months before the Canadian federal election. And I really hope that the Liberal government is going to use this opportunity to, educate Canadians on essentially what has happened here. And I do agree, some criticism here. I do agree that perhaps the messaging from the outset when this issue with respect to SNC arose wasn't as transparent. And I can tell you from a legal perspective, and sadly, it seems that there's little concern for what's legally untoward, and the court of public opinion is more concerned about brand damage, but nothing legally untoward happened. When looking at a deferred prosecution agreement or a remediation agreement, which is essentially what the Liberal government had asked our previous Attorney General to consider, the perception, unfortunately, is that it is some sort of slap on the wrist. Yes, you are avoiding criminal prosecution, but I think it's really important for your viewers to understand that while you are avoiding criminal trial, there's a disgorgement of any profits that you would have made as a result of any of the purported unlawful behavior. There's also the paying of an extremely hefty fine, and clearly demonstrating to the government through some very close monitoring that could last years that you've cleaned house and all the perpetrators or even the alleged perpetrators are no longer there. So this view that, there was something, sneaky happening and they were trying to get them to agree to this underhanded agreement, I think that's where most of the problems, unfortunately, have arisen. So much to say on this, but I thought it was important to give that background on the remediation agreement.
And that makes sense. The idea of something sneaky happening, though, is something that people online are raising, and at issue, part of this issue is a secret recording. I want our audience to have a listen to this. Jody Wilson-Raybould, while still Attorney General, drew fire from the Liberal Party for secretly recording another member, an aide to Justin Trudeau. And here's what that sounded like.
His view is he's not asking you to do anything appropriate or to interfere. He's asking you to use all of the tools that you lawfully have at your disposal.
I know I have a tool under the Prosecution Act that I can use. I do not believe it is appropriate to use it in this case.
Okay. All right. Then that's clear. He's in a very firm mood about this. So.
Does he understand the gravity of what this potentially could mean? This is not just about saving jobs. This is about interfering with one of our fundamental institutions. This is like breaching a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence. So we can.
I don't think he sees it as that.
Well, then nobody's explaining that to him, Michael.
So this is a 17-minute audio recording. I just wanted to share with our audience that this is just a clip up, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess there's a number of things that I want to say about this recording. First and foremost, what she did, what our previous Attorney General did, as far as I'm concerned as a lawyer, breaches her obligations from a law society perspective. So to be very clear, in my view, what she has done is grossly unethical. She was the Attorney General at the time that conversation took place, which means Michael Wernick is her client. And the rules quite clearly spell out that you are not allowed to your client. No. So that's the first issue as far as unethical.
Say that's true. Say that's all true.
Well, it is true.
That. But the question is what's on the tape, not the circumstances of its recording. We're not nominating Jody Wilson-Raybould for sainthood here. The question is.
Well, I think a lot of people were nominating her for sainthood, and this recording did a really good job of eroding the narrative around her as a whistleblower and a martyr. So I think the fact that it's unethical, and there's been a number of.
How does the tape make her not a whistleblower? All it did was back up the testimony that she had.
Well, as a lawyer, I can tell you that in listening to that tape, and this is a criticism that has come down the pipeline, and that's been posed to her by a number of journalists. It sounds extremely scripted. So that sounds like the perfect, some of the little, things that she says, some of the little snippets. They sound precisely like the type of things you would want to say when you are almost certain that the tape is going to be produced in some public forum. Essentially, that's. So what?
You're also in a situation.
So Muniz and Chris, I hear where you're coming from. I want to bring in Nigan, though, because we haven't heard his voice in a minute. Go ahead.
I just point out that, we are in a situation in which Jody Wilson-Raybould is feeling a question of her safety and also of her career. After having, for 4 years, backed the Trudeau government, she had been basically the de facto Indigenous Affairs Minister, without the name, of course, had presented the Liberal agenda on Indigenous issues to Indigenous peoples. Now she is saying, I want to do my job. I want to employ my position, and my position is that there is no other ways. I don't need a third opinion. I understand the prosecution agreement. I'm expecting that the prosecution that will be held is as an objective position. She made the decision, but then continued to experience the same pressure. And in that situation, had felt as though her safety was at risk. So in that situation, this is an egregious circumstance, and taping a conversation is not an unethical one. It's one of safety. It's a one of making a choice in a difficult situation in which if it did reach the public, which she had no interest in doing until much later, until she was thrown under the bus, then she brought it out to the public. But in a situation, if it had reached the public, then she would be the one that would lose. And so we have to think of this in the long history of the treatment of Indigenous peoples. And it was all fine and good when Jody Wilson-Raybould was presenting the Liberal agenda. But suddenly when she's doing her job and also bringing her ethics into the situation, suddenly now she's a problem.
And so I want to pick up on that. I actually want to pick up on that just a little bit of what Nigan said, because for our audience that doesn't know, Jody Wilson-Raybould was the first Indigenous Attorney General of the country in Canadian history. So here is what our audience thinks about that. And
also one of the very first Indigenous cabinet ministers ever.
Right. Here is what one person online thinks about that. Whisper here says that the Prime Minister kicked them out of the Liberal Party, and goes on to say he continues to hurt my people, First Nations. He's a coward, a fake, a liar. I could go on. Sadly, all settler government leaders are just like him. Now, I actually want you to hear the Prime Minister in his own words, because a number of Liberal Party MPs have stood by him as this is unfolded in the press and in Parliament. So here's what the Prime Minister, Trudeau, said last week about why Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott were expelled from the caucus.
Civil wars within parties are incredibly damaging because they signal to Canadians that we care more about ourselves than we do about them. That's why I made the difficult decision to remove Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Dr. Philpott from the Liberal caucus. We've taken every effort to address their concerns. But ultimately, if they can't honestly say that they have confidence in this team, despite weeks of testimony, face-to-face conversations, and phone calls with myself and other members of caucus, then they cannot be part of this team.
So, Chris, you started this off saying the word civil war. What's your take on the reasoning behind this? Because he says it's about trust.
Well, it's a very Canadian civil war. I mean, there's no other country in the world that I'm aware of where a party cannot tolerate this little dissent. You had two former cabinet ministers who had resigned from cabinet but were still in caucus and were saying to anyone who would ask that they still supported the government and they still supported Trudeau's agenda, broadly speaking. They just had one problem with this one issue. And the idea that that would necessitate kicking out these two very accomplished people, I don't understand. Well, I do understand it. That's how Canadian politics sort of works. But again, Trudeau was supposed to be able to do politics differently. And here he was again saying, that this party cannot tolerate what is really not that much internal dissent at the end of the day.
Muniza?
I disagree with that entirely. Ultimately, the way you have to look at it is, even though it's not a common law workplace, and I am an employment lawyer, so excuse the employment spin, we're talking about two federal cabinet ministers. Their boss is the Prime Minister. They're reporting into the cabinet. And ultimately, if you start making disparaging remarks, and let's talk about that a little bit. So we're not talking about disparaging remarks on one core issue where you say that, well, I support the entire, Liberal Party in its entirety, but it's this one issue. Well, I'm going to get there, Chris. And so what you're essentially doing is you're questioning the ethics and the integrity of the entire federal Liberal Party as far as it relates to a very serious issue around SNC. So it's not just, we have a difference of opinion. No, they asked me to do something unethical. They asked me to do something legally untoward. And if you're making defamatory and disparaging remarks about your employer, and myself and a number of other Canadians do feel that, in fact, these were comments that were extremely hurtful to the Liberal Party, then guess what? You're no longer standing in solidarity with your employer. You're causing significant brand damage. And I think the decision to terminate their employment was a wise one, particularly given the fact that we're dealing with this in a federal election year. It was not just one core issue. We can see by the staggering numbers that you presented at the outset of this interview that this one issue that they're dissenting on has caused significant amount of damage to the Liberal Party, such that if there was an election today, we're not sure we would see a win at all. So yes, it's a huge issue. Yes, they were flying, but their comments were flying in the face of the core values of the Liberal Party. It was time for them to go, and I'm glad they're gone.
It's very telling to hear.
Do you know what would have turned these
numbers around? MPs as employees. That's very.
I'm an employment lawyer.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in here, Chris and Muniza and Nigan. I'm going to jump in here because there's someone on Twitter who I think would agree with what you were just saying there, Muniza. Shannon says, this is not about feminism. Do you understand the meaning of feminism? Some little tongue-in-cheek.
Not a racialized issue either.
Shannon says, equality and not special treatment is the actual meaning behind it. And the Prime Minister lifted up these two women, and in the long run, they kept pushing an issue that was harming the party. Man or woman, they would have to go. So that's one side of the argument. But Nigan, I want to play for you a comment that we got from a former stream guest and also an assistant professor at a university in Canada. And Pom Palmater, she explains that this is about dissent and what you do to voices that go against what she calls the old boys club. Have a listen.
His removal of Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott shows very clearly that he is not a feminist, because he was the one who breached the trust by trying to pressure Jody Wilson-Raybould. And when she stood up to the inappropriate political pressure, instead of embracing the fact that he had a strong cabinet member who wanted to call out wrongdoing and really make his own party much better and better for all Canadians, he decided to go with the old boys option of blaming Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould for not being trustworthy and booting them out of the party. He could have and should have done so much better.
Nigan?
And I would add that would have turned the numbers around. You want to know what would turn the numbers around? Is humility, generosity, commitment. I wrote this in one of my columns for the Winnipeg Free Press. I said, imagine that he had committed to them, and he had committed to them in such a way that he had indicated that dissenting opinions was of a crucial part of the Liberal Party. Instead, what you come off looking at is that you're only you only really want Indigenous peoples, women, as long as they follow the party line. But as soon as they begin to show, like Jody Wilson-Raybould particularly, by talking about, she talked about being a member of the Quaqua people, which is an Indigenous people out in British Columbia. And she said this is very much an ethic of standing up against oppression, standing up against a company, SNC-Lavalin, that only bribed officials, but also did things like funded escapades for people from Libya to have prostitutes in Canada and so on and so forth. This is all reported by the Montreal-based press. When all of these things are present, there's an ethical question. And by her bringing the question of what would I do as an Indigenous woman facing this situation, of course I'm going to bring ethics into the equation. And therefore, this is very much an issue about Indigenous people, very much an issue about women. And also when women stand up, when Indigenous people stand up and have opinions, how they are treated.
I would agree.
Go ahead, Muniza, go ahead.
Well, my point is, with respect, some of your comments, Nigan, around, what the remediation agreement or a deferred prosecution agreement means. Again, there seems to be this perception, and I think that's really what has spearheaded the amount of outrage against the Liberal Party around this, is that somehow it is nothing more than a slap on the wrist. And I can't reiterate enough that in fact it isn't. The only benefit that the company would be able to glean, from being able to secure an agreement of this nature is they are still allowed to have federal contracts, and essentially people don't lose their jobs. One quick point I want to make, with respect to removing these two women from Liberal caucus, this is something that the Canadian government has seen before. Back in 2012, Prime Minister Harper at the time also, and unfortunately I've forgotten the name of the MP, there was an MP, and again there were some ethical concerns with respect to some comments that she had made, some offshore accounts also that she had, some comments she had made in relation to her husband even, and Prime Minister Harper at the time had forced a resignation. So this isn't some anomaly situation that we have.
That has nothing to do with this.
Stephen Harper is
Okay, so I hear I hear what you're saying there, and I want to share with you two tweets from people giving us a little perspective on what is next, pushing this forward. A Beach Boys fan says, "This scandal is insurmountable for Justin Trudeau. He'll never overcome it. He's plummeting in the polls irreversibly. The only election hope remaining for the Liberal Party is to remove him." Another person writes in saying that he has no political future. The sooner the Liberal Party accepts this, the sooner a new leader can be installed. Canada is paying a massive price for his actions. Waiting for the election will only cause more damage. So pretty strongly worded tweets there, Chris. In your view, I mean, we have until October and so much can change and happen in these next few months. Do you agree with these people who say he has no political future?
No, I mean, Trudeau's not going anywhere. He will lead the Liberals into the next election, and he could well win another majority. The Liberals seem to be doing their best to keep this in the news as much as possible, and I don't know why. But no, he certainly has a political future. This is an eminently survivable problem he has here. He could have done a much better job from the start trying to survive it. But no, he's not done. I mean, Canadians do not change horses on a whim.
Yeah, and I would add too that Trudeau's has a track record beyond this issue, of course. Mm-hmm. There are many aspects within Trudeau's legacy here for the past 3.5 years in which his relationships with Indigenous peoples have been good intentioned but have followed the same violent, oppressive paths of the past. However, that being said, Indigenous peoples came out and supported Trudeau to be elected within this framework. I really doubt that electorate's going to continue. However, there are many different blocks of support that he has been able to shore up throughout the country. What I would say is that his brand is irrecoverably damaged. He has built a brand on doing politics in a different way, reaching out to Indigenous peoples, wanting a different relationship, bringing women into the party. All of that has been damaged. All of that, and I would say that has been irrevocably damaged.
Mm-hmm. I don't believe that the relationship is unsalvageable. I do agree with both my fellow panel members that there has been a significant amount of damage. I think it would be foolish not to admit otherwise. But I think those who truly support the Liberal Party will do a lot of investigating between now and the federal election because they do have that desire to support the platform that they've consistently supported for the better part of the 4 years. Now, I do think, some of the transparency from the Liberal Party that we've seen as far as an explanation as to what exactly happened should have come down the pipeline a little bit earlier. And so I do agree with the comments around humility, because I think, the public perception was that just a blanket denial, Canadians didn't like it. Canadians, they understand the issues. So I think we see the Liberal Party now, the federal government now coming forward with some more clear and cogent explanations as to whether or not this was, lawful or unlawful. And I do think it's an important point, because what Chris had mentioned earlier when I brought up the issue of ethics, and forgive me, Chris, if it wasn't you and I'm mistaken, it is an ethics issue. So with respect to our previous Attorney General, we can't say, she taped the conversation with Wernick and, it was about her protecting her job, or with respect to, worrying about whether this issue was going to go public, when if what she's saying rests on this idea of the rule of law, you cannot have it both ways and say it only, applies to the Liberal Party as far as prosecutorial misconduct, but when it comes to behavior that I've taken part in, it's not, the rule of law wouldn't apply. So I think that's a serious issue. And I think the narrative around, our previous Attorney General is starting to change. And I think that's going to help the Liberal Party.
Muniza, I have to pause you there. It's a perfect place to end this conversation because so much can happen and we will be looking forward to what happens. That's all the time we have for this part of the conversation, though. So you can follow the latest on this issue by visiting aljazeera.com, and you can continue this conversation online by following us on Twitter. We are at AJ Stream. Our thanks to Chris Selly, Muniza Sheikh, and Nigan Sinclair for being part of this conversation, and of course to you online. We'll see you all next time.